Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Shabbat Shalom. Yesterday, I wrote to the congregation about the latest wave of hurtful anti-Semitism, from pitiful vandals to star-studded athletes and music celebrities to local business owners. And last night, Rabbi Goodman spoke clearly and with conviction that we must speak out against hatred of all kinds, including and especially when fellow Jews are the targets. Today, I want to speak about how these days feel. I want to acknowledge the heaviness of this time. We are all carrying many layers of burden and grief, layers of fear and anxiety, layers of sadness and loneliness. I want to acknowledge it all. The Jewish calendar instructs us now to take it all on and to weep, to bow together in lament. For we are now deep into the 3 weeks between the 17th day of Tammuz, when the ancient walls of Jerusalem were breached, and the 9th day of Av, when the temple was destroyed, not once, but twice. And our ancestors were not once, but twice carted off to exile and homelessness that would last 2,000 years. Emotionally speaking, the darkest days of the Jewish calendar are surprisingly set in contrast to the physically brightest days of the year. It's a strange juxtaposition. And there are no weddings. One of the most joyful scenes in Jewish life is a wedding. Usually spring and summer is high wedding season. Over the last 4 months, I've worked with wedding couples as they agonized over what to do. Through tears, they deliberate whether to put their lives on hold indefinitely and wait for the wedding of their dreams, or to stand now at the chuppah without their grandparents who would be at risk, and in some cases without their parents and siblings who live across the country and cannot travel. It's a painful choice. Some couples have planned 2 weddings, one now, a backyard chuppah for 10 people, and then a year from now, when God willing, they can gather again to renew their vows and dance a hora, embraced by loved ones from near and far. I admit that I am desperate for wedding season. It has been personally difficult and professionally difficult to officiate at so many graveside funerals, too many funerals during this pandemic, and not one wedding. The imbalance between these occasions of life and death, between these shared expressions of joy and sorrow, can be depressing. I am pleased to share with you that the Holy Blossom community will see 5 couples make their way to the chuppah in the weeks that follow Tisha B'Av. I think I might be dreaming about those weddings as much as the brides are, because as always, each chuppah is an emblem of hope in the Jewish future. It is a symbol of the reinforcement of the Shalshelet Hadorot, the chain of the generations of Jewish continuity. But now each chuppah takes on an additional significance. In the midst of a global pandemic, a wedding is an affirmation of life. It is evidence that life will find a way, come what may. That the biblical author of Song of Songs was right when he claimed that love is stronger than death. A century ago, a very large Jewish wedding took place in New York, not in spite of the Spanish flu epidemic ravaging the city, but precisely because of it. What's more, both the dead and the living were invited to the ceremony. The November 4th, 1918 edition of the Evening World newspaper covered the story. There it is written, "In Mount Hebron Cemetery, Miss Rose Schwartz, number 369 East 10th Street, stood beside Abraham Lachterman from number 638 East 11th Street yesterday afternoon, and before them stood Rabbi Unger, who performed a wedding ceremony. The tradition upon which the couple acted is an ancient Jewish one, which declares that the only way to stop a plague is to hold a marriage ceremony in the cemetery. The newspaper reports that 2,000 people cheered on the couple for offering themselves up to stop the epidemic. That strange gathering in Queens was known as a Schwarze Chasana, a black wedding, or a Magefa Chasana, a plague wedding. What is a plague wedding or a black wedding? It is a relatively new innovation. There's no reference to it in biblical or Talmudic or even medieval texts. First evidence of it comes from the late 18th century in Ukraine, and again in 1831 in the midst of Russia's first cholera pandemic, and then again another in 1849 in Krakow. The Public Ledger of Philadelphia reports on a Magefa Chasana in the early 1900s, quote, "The attention of God would be called to the affliction of their fellows if the most humble man and woman among them should be joined in marriage in the presence of the dead." Two marginalized people, whether orphans or impoverished or struggling with some disability, were matched and married. One plague wedding included a bride who lost an eye in a pogrom. Another included a groom who returned from World War I so traumatized that he could no longer speak. The theological logic of a black wedding is that seeing a bride and groom who had known such suffering, nevertheless find companionship or a chance at love, perhaps, under the chuppah, would stir up God's empathy. God would be so moved by this deeply human display of hope that God would have Rahmanis and pour out enough compassion not only to bless the wedding couple, but also enough love to wash over the entire community gathered at the wedding so that the plague would be checked and the cemetery would grow quiet. During the Spanish flu epidemic, nearly 13,000 people in Winnipeg were infected and more than 800 died. People were desperate. In his new family memoir in progress called The End of Her, Tablet Magazine executive editor Wayne Hoffman describes the astonishing story of Canada's first and possibly last plague wedding. Held on November 10th, 1918, it united Harry Fleckman and Dora Wiseman. Quote, "At one end of the Shaarei Tzedek Cemetery in the city's north end, a ceremony that drew more than 1,000 Jewish and Gentile guests had a minion of 10 men on the other side conducting a funeral for an influenza victim at the other end of the graveyard," end quote. The city's Yiddish newspapers criticized the rabbis for allowing such a ceremony to take place, for fear that people might use it to replace real medical attention. But this strange and rare Jewish custom is a dramatic way not only to capture God's attention and appeal to God's attribute of Rahmanut, but it is also a brave and bold way to break through our own human fears, to shake ourselves from the grips of anxiety, to demonstrate that we do not fear the grave. So let me clarify, I do not suggest that we gather in large numbers for anything today, not even for a wedding, God forbid. Not until public health says it is safe to do so, and even then we will do so using utmost caution and proper protocols in place. I share this strange and hardly heard of custom with you today because I do admire the human impulse to live and love in the midst of a plague. I do empathize with those who went to dance at a cemetery where loved ones were buried as a public display of their commitment to survive and to survive joyfully, l'dor vador, from generation to generation. In the very place designated for death, they affirmed life. A superstition? Yes. Strange? Absolutely. A custom only found deep in the archives of Jewish newspapers? No. It may or may not surprise you that this past March, 2 orphans were married in a cemetery in Bnei Brak in Israel. Everyone was safely 6 feet apart from one another, including the dead, 6 feet underground. The community gave tzedakah to pay for the wedding and for outfitting the couple's new home. This display of generosity and care was intended to soften God's heart in the midst of a pandemic. Just as compassion is extended from one to the other here on earth, on the human plane, they prayed that God would be moved to act with compassion and bring an end to coronavirus. To be clear, I do not believe today's plague will be checked by way of miraculous divine intervention. Not because the all-powerful God couldn't, but because God doesn't, because God won't. Suffering is often the price humanity pays for the gift of free will. This rabbi believes that today's plague will be checked not all at once by God's saving power, but gradually by human responsibility. Bimhera b'yameinu, may it come soon and speedily in our own time. And there is something about this life-affirming power of a wedding, isn't there? For those 20 minutes under the chuppah, it feels that anything is possible, that the world is completely full of nothing but potential and promise, that love wins, and that there is a future to plan for, to delight in, and to be grateful for. Professor Susanna Heschel writes, the Schwarze Chasana is not a rebellion against disease, nor an attempt to end the pandemic, but a chance to address the terror. A wedding, a moment of joy, is held in a place of death and sorrow. A wedding is organized at a time when disease is hovering over every household. Why a Schwarze Chasana? Certainly, it is an effort of the community to do a good deed for 2 people who might otherwise be neglected and overlooked, but also an appeal to God to lift the epidemic. Perhaps it was intended to fool the forces of evil into thinking they have no power at all. Or perhaps it is a way to deceive one's own emotions, rejoicing when the heart is filled with mourning. If the ancient temple walls were torn down and the tablets of the law were smashed on the 17th of Tammuz, the chuppah is its inverse, when people are bound up in one another, and the covenantal relationship is sealed kedat Moshe v'Yisrael, according to the law of Moses and the people of Israel. If Tisha B'Av is the darkest day when all is broken and shattered and God seems absent and silent, then a wedding day is its inverse, when all is unified and God's presence draws near and our voices sing songs of praise. Rejoicing when the heart is filled with mourning. This is the Jewish way. It has been for our entire history. The narratives we tell speak of it. Rejoicing when the heart is filled with mourning. We know it in our own lifetimes. The book of Numbers ends with the orphaned daughters of Tzalachad stepping forward in the midst of the people and before Moses, when everything was broken around them. It may have seemed hopeless. But they stepped forward, and in a clear voice, they claimed their portion in this lifetime. They demanded a future of promise. Against the backdrop of the laws of death in this parsha comes an end of a hopeful message. So may it be for us during these fragile days. Let us remind one another that joy can be found in the midst of our mourning. Sometimes we have to force a moment of joy. Sometimes we must pray for God's mercy, even as we take up our own responsibilities for the sorrows and the sufferings. And let us remember this Shabbat that we can turn to one another like a wedding couple and say, as Jews say everywhere this Shabbat to one another at the conclusion of a book of Torah, Chazak, Chazak, v'nitchazek. Be strong, and let us strengthen one another.